Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have my October wrap up. So the month of October, I did not finish everything that I needed to read in the month. However, I did still read 10 books. So the amount of books that I read, the amount of pages I read, everything like that was average for me. It was kind of just like a standard reading month in terms of how much I actually read. All of the ratings for this month were pretty good. In fact, they are almost identical to last month. I'm rating the majority of my books 4 and 5 stars, which leaves me a little bit conflicted, you know, because on the one hand, I'm like, yes, all of these books that I'm reading are really good, but then it makes me question my judgment as a reviewer if I'm giving all of my books really good ratings. But I tend to, like, I'm not afraid to give a 2-star review or a ton of 3 stars if I'm just not that into books. So it is just that all of the books that I'm reading, I am actually really enjoying. So as I have read quite a bit in the month of October, I have already done a mid-month wrap up. So if you guys would like to see reviews for these 3 books, which are The Way of Kings Part 2 by Brandon Sanderson, Dreaming Sun Volume 2 by Ichigo Takano, Winterwood by Shay Earnshaw, and The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V. Schwab, then I will link my mid-month wrap up here for you guys. But this video is going to be me talking about the other 6 books I read in October. So before we get started, I will just run through my statistics for the month. In the month of October, I read 3,769 pages, which breaks down to an average of 121 pages per day. For my star ratings, I had 2 3 stars, 6 4 stars, and 2 5-star reads, which breaks down to an average rating of 4 stars per book. For the demographics, we had 4 young adult books and 6 adults. For the formats, we had 5 standardly formatted novels, 3 ebooks, and 2 manga. For the genres, we had 7 fantasy, 2 contemporary, and 1 horror. And lastly, the places where I sourced the books that I read this month, 4 of them I have hauled in 2020, 3 of them were ARCs from NetGalley, 2 of them I borrowed from Ashley from Frolic Through Fiction, and only 1 of them was from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2020, which is really bad and something that I need to get better at because I'm just not reading any of my backlist. So getting into the reviews, the first book that I finished in the second half of October was Words of Radiance Part 1 by Brandon Sanderson. At what point do I stop talking about this series and giving you a full synopsis? Because there's going to be, I'm gonna estimate, at least 1/2 of one book in this series in every single wrap up that I do, as well as the majority of the reading vlogs that I do. But if you are unfamiliar with Words of Radiance, it is the 2nd book in the Stormlight Archive, which is one of the series in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere. It is his biggest and most expansive series to date. The 4th book is released in November 2020 and it is going to be 10 books eventually. It's a really hefty series. So this is just the first half of Words of Radiance. This story follows a multitude of characters. It's a multi-perspective adult epic fantasy, but the majority of the plot is to do with a war between the Alethi and the Parshendi. The Parshendi orchestrated the assassination of the Alethi king during a time when they were supposed to be signing a peace treaty, and the Alethi retaliated by going to war against the Parshendi in order to gain revenge. However, this war has become more about greed. It's happening on the Shattered Plains, which is a series of plateaus, and there are things called gem hearts that they can capture on the Shattered Plains, which are incredibly valuable. So the 9 Alethi high princes are pretty much in competition against each other to see how many gem hearts each of them can gain, and the original purpose of the war has kind of been lost. So I give this one 5 stars. I enjoyed it more than Way of Kings. This is just generally a little bit more compelling than Way of Kings. Way of Kings is like 1,000 pages of setup pretty much, and towards the end of Way of Kings the pace starts to pick up, things about the plot are revealed, it all just gets a little bit more interesting just before the book ends, and then as soon as you're into Words of Radiance it's already expanding on that. This has already been more action packed, I want to say, or just more things generally happening than in Way of Kings. As for the characters, I've definitely started to bond with them a little bit more. Kaladin in Way of Kings, I liked him. I'm definitely growing more attached to him in here. My favorite characters in here are still probably Dalinar and Adolin. Shallan, interestingly, was my favorite perspective to read from in Way of Kings, and in Words of Radiance I'm just less interested, which seems to be an unpopular opinion. I believe that a very common opinion on Shelflove is that she's very annoying and people don't really like her very much in Way of Kings, but they like her more in Words of Radiance, where for me it tends to be the opposite. And I think that is just because Kaladin, Dalinar, and Adolin's perspective in Words of Radiance are so much more interesting to me. So it's not necessarily that I'm disliking Shallan's chapters, it's just every time I have a chapter from her However, it's longer that I have to wait for a chapter from Kaladin or Dalinar and what's happening with them, and that is definitely where my attention is at the moment when reading Words of Radiance. But overall, really enjoying this. Read this significantly faster than I read Way of Kings, and I'm really excited to move into part 2, which will be my first book of October. The next book that I read was Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. This one is the Illumicrate edition. I did have an arc of this from NetGalley, but I was a little bit late to reading it, so by the time I actually got around to it, my physical copy from Illumicrate had arrived. And my thoughts on this book are complicated to say the least. So in this book, we are following a character called Elle. Elle is in her junior year at the Scholomance, which is a magical school that children who are magically gifted are sent to because the real world is really dangerous. Now, the Scholomance is also really dangerous. However, if you attend the Scholomance, you have a 1 in 4 chance of surviving, as opposed to if you don't, where you have a 1 in 20 chance. So Elle is a little bit of an outsider. She's very sarcastic. She's very snarky. She's also very closed off and defensive. And this story starts off where she's incredibly annoyed because a boy in her year called Orion keeps saving her life, and she doesn't want to feel indebted to him. She doesn't think that she needs him. He inconveniences her more than he actually helps her, despite the fact that he's saving her life. And that's kind of where the story kicks off, and there is definitely a lot about their friendship, because essentially the way to survive the Scholomance is to either join an enclave or make an alliance. And with Elle being incredibly closed off and defensive, she's lacking both of these things. Aside from that, she also has an affinity with dark magic. So after Orion has saved her life, he starts to take more interest in her to make sure that she isn't a dark sorceress. And because the class hero is paying attention to her, other people start to pay attention to her as well. And she uses this to her advantage to try and get into an enclave or build an alliance, just anything to assure her survival before graduation. So my mixed feelings on this. The things that I loved about this, I absolutely love the character of Elle. I identified with her a lot, the way that she behaves, the way that she was treated. She comes from a background where she has been hurt several times by just general people, but also people who should be close to her, and because of that, she has become incredibly defensive and incredibly standoffish. She doesn't know how to behave with people. She's not, I don't want to say she's rude to people. She is a little bit rude to people, but she also, just the sarcasm, some of the things that she calls Orion throughout this book, I just loved it. She says at one point he has about as much use as an unvarnished deck chair, and I really enjoyed that. I also really enjoy the setting of this and the idea behind this, of this very deadly magic school. And it's interesting because that is kind of like directly linking into the things that I really didn't like about this, which is not necessarily the writing, because there were some elements of the writing that I really loved. Like, there's references to pop culture and like classic literature in here, done in a really like offhand, sarcastic, conversational way, and I did enjoy how they were brought into the story in this really natural kind of snarky manner. Other elements of the writing I really hated. The first one is a complete personal preference thing, and that is that parts of this book are told in a conversational style, which personally is something that I just don't particularly like. It was almost like Elle was breaking the fourth wall and talking to the reader. And on top of that, the parts of this book that were conversational were the endless amounts of exposition in here. It was just driving me mad. So all throughout this book, it's told in kind of like a plot-driven narrative, and the world building is filled in through these moments of exposition. However, a lot of times they were just kind of irrelevant. They would interrupt the story, so Elle would be doing something and it would say, oh, by the way, I'm doing this thing because 500 years ago this thing happened with this wizard, and the school reacted to it like that, and then this is why I know how to do this thing, in a really conversational way, with personal preference, not my thing. And I just really did not enjoy that about it. One reason is just because I found it irritating, and another is that it really took me out of this story, because these areas of exposition are not just a paragraph. They can be like 3-4 pages in length, so by the time you get back to the narrative, you've forgotten what it was that Elle was doing that brought on this like endless word vomit of information. I'm just really torn about this. I gave it 3 stars in the end, because in one hand I absolutely adore this and I definitely cannot wait to read the sequel. My overall thoughts about this are positive, but I could just not give it any higher than 3 stars with the way that the endless exposition just really got to me, and I really disliked it. The next book I read was also an ARC that I received on NetGalley. I do also have a physical copy of this on its way to me, and that was Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerri Maniscalco. This is a young adult fantasy. It is the first book in a new series from Kerri Maniscalco, and it follows the twins Amelia and Vittoria. It is set in Italy, I believe it is Sicily, and Amelia and Vittoria's parents own a trattoria, so there is a lot of talk of food in this book, and just the setting of this and all of this food description, because Amelia really likes to cook and experiment with food as well, just had me really wishing I was back in Rome at That's Amore, drinking spritzes, eating seafood spaghetti and Mila Fogli, and just living my best life. So the crux of the plot in this story is that Vittoria is killed. Her heart is ripped out, she's violently murdered, and Amelia wants to get to the bottom of who exactly has done this, why they have done this, and also seek revenge. So to do this, she starts to dabble in the dark magic that she has been warned against her entire life by her nonna, and she summons a prince of hell called Wrath, and he claims that he's on her side. However, she has been brought up being told you absolutely cannot 100% trust the princes of hell. If the princes of hell are in this realm, then life as we know it will be over. And so even though she kind of wants to trust Wrath because she needs his help in finding out who murdered her sister, she's very reluctant to do so. I gave this 4 stars. I ended up really enjoying it in the end, even though I didn't love the beginning. So the first 40% of this, I just really struggled to get into it. I wanted to love it so much. I was really enjoying the atmosphere, but there was just something about it that didn't really grip me. The first 40% of this reminded me a lot of Bone Crier's Moon by Catherine Purdy, which is a book that I didn't love, and it was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, so I was really disappointed. And when I started to see the same themes in Kingdom of the Wicked and have the same feeling when I was reading it, I was starting to get really disappointed because I really wanted to love this. However, when I got past the first 40%, I did start to really love it. The character of Amelia, I did like her, but I didn't feel especially connected to her, and I wasn't particularly pulled in by her. However, by the end, the character arc that she is on has me really intrigued for the sequel, and I really want to see where her character is going, because I do think that the further this series goes on, the more I'm going to really enjoy her. The character of Wrath, who is the Prince of Hell, I loved him. He kind of fits into the character archetype that we saw a lot in young adult paranormal romance back in like 2010, around that time, and he reminds me the most of Patch from the Hush Hush series. He's just like this dark, brooding, like morally grey character. He's a Prince of Hell, and he's also the embodiment of Wrath, so he's quite hot-headed. He can be kind of hostile. I liked his sarcastic bluntness and the way that he would respond to some of the questions that Amelia asked him. And when he started to become more present in the story is when I started to get a lot more invested. One of the things that really shook me with this book is that the ending hurt. I didn't feel like I was that invested in it, but when I started reading the last chapter, I was just so confused. I was so confused. Like, I have so many questions just about that last chapter. Like, I can't say anything obviously because of spoilers, but I just need more, and having to wait at least, I'm assuming it's going to be at least a year until the sequel, is going to be a really not fun time for me. But I am really glad that I enjoyed this book in the end, because when I read the synopsis, I thought it would be something that I really enjoyed. When I read the beginning, I wasn't that into it, and I'm just really glad that it pulled through for me in the end. I then read Gods of Jade and Shadow by Sylvia Marino Garcia. This was my Patreon Inner Circle book draw book for the month of October. This one was recommended by Kylie. My patrons have actually been really nice to me with the recommendations that they've been giving me, because I pretty much opened it up to anything, you know. I said, you can recommend me literally any book. I don't have to own it or anything, just any book that you want me to read, I will read it. But they were all really nice and recommended me books I'm either interested in or books that they think that I will genuinely like because of elements that are in there. And this is a book that has kind of been on the outskirts of my radar, but for some reason I thought that this book was going to be like really literary fantasy, and it's not. This has elements in it that I really love. I'm not going to tell you about the specific element in it that I just did not expect, because I do think it's good if you go into this and don't expect it and you're a little bit shocked like I was. But this is an adult standalone fantasy that follows a young girl called Cassiopeia Tunn. It is a historical fantasy, and it is set in the Jazz Age. I believe specifically it's 1927, and Cassiopeia would like to join in with the Jazz Age. However, she has responsibilities at home because because of the actions of her mother and who her father is, the rest of her family do not treat her very well at all. She is pretty much the servant of the household, and she is responsible for cleaning her grandfather's house. One day when the rest of her family are away, Cassiopeia opens a mysterious chest at the foot of her grandfather's bed and accidentally releases a Mayan god of death, who she then has to go with on a quest for him to find the body parts that were taken away from him when Cassiopeia's grandfather and the death god's brother imprisoned him. I ended up really enjoying this. I gave it 4 stars. It reminds me a lot of The Bear and the Nightingale, but if you take all of the Russian folklore away from it and replace it with Mexican folklore and Mayan mythology, it is the same kind of story. I think there are a lot of similarities in the plot between the 2 books, which is why this book had a really timeless feel to me. This feels like a book that would be read aloud. It is kind of like a fairy tale in the story structure, just quite a bit longer than your average fairy tale. I don't typically like standalone fantasy, but there are certain ways that it can be done that I end up really enjoying it, and this is one of those ways where it feels like an old-timey, like, classical tale. Something I think that Silvia Moreno Garcia did really well in this as well is gave me an antagonist that I absolutely hated. I've read quite a few of them recently that are just literally the worst. Like, villains in stories, I can sometimes get behind them because I just like people who fuck with the system, fuck with the plot, and fuck with the main characters, essentially. But the antagonist in this is generally one of those really well-crafted villains where you just really do not like them. The best kind for me are the ones where you just feel like they're pathetic and they just really need to stop and get over themselves, and that is the kind of antagonist that we have in here. I also really liked the plot. I liked the character of Cassiopeia. I liked the death god Hunkame, and I can't tell you the element of the plot in this I really loved because, like I said, I would like you to experience it for yourself, but it was just unexpected, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm surprised because this book, like I said, I thought it was literary fantasy. It's really not. And if you guys like the same kind of books that I do, if you like The Bear and the Nightingale, then I would recommend that you pick up Gods of Jade and Shadow. I then read another NetGalley arc. This one was a manga, and it was The Witch and the Beast by Kusuke Satake. So this is one where the cover really pulled me in. I was intrigued by the synopsis. I requested it on NetGalley. I was approved. I had to replace something on my Bookopoly TBR anyway, so I thought I may as well just read this as I'd just been approved for it. So in this book, we follow 2 main characters. We have a young girl called Guido who has a vendetta against witches, and a man called Afshan who is part of this company that pretty much fix magical problems. Like, if you have a magical beast that has escaped, he will come and help you capture it again. If you have a magical chest that needs unlocking, he can help with that. If you have a witch that needs hunting, he can help with that. And the story is about these 2 characters who work together for this company. Afshan because it is just genuinely his job, and Guido because she wants to hunt witches because a witch has put a curse on her and she needs to find a way to break it. So I gave this one 3 stars. I didn't enjoy the first half of it, but I did enjoy the second half, which was kind of my problem why it got a middle of the road rating. We start off with just like this really fast-paced action sequence where they've just found a witch, and it's like a mini story within the whole storyline, I guess, designed to introduce you to the characters, what they can do, what their agenda is, and things like that. I personally don't like manga or comics or anything that are incredibly action based because I've mentioned this before, I'm not very visually minded in terms of things like I'm not really very good at reading diagrams, so lots of pictures with very little text I do struggle with. It's a complete just like personal thing. I do really like manga and graphic novels, but I like them to be a little bit slower paced. If we have big action scenes, I just really struggle to follow them. So after we got through the whole beginning half of this, it did really start to slow down. We learned a little bit more about the characters, and it started another plot line that was a lot more slower paced, and that bit I really enjoyed. This series is like fantasy horror, so there are some elements of horror in here, like particularly grisly murders that are depicted on the page in the art. I think it was a pretty good start to a series. When I finished this first volume, I was intrigued to carry on. I don't know if I will yet because I did have such mixed feelings, but I wouldn't be opposed to it. And then then the final book that I read in the month of October was The Black Flamingo by Dean Atter. So this is a standalone contemporary book that is told in verse, and it follows a young man called Michael, and it is a coming of age story essentially. Michael is mixed race, he's also queer, and it follows him coming to terms with and exploring his identity. I think that the earliest age that we see him is 6 years old, and it goes all the way up to him being around 20, where he starts to become involved in the drag scene. I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 stars. Verse can be a little bit hit or miss with me. I did really enjoy it in this instance. I really enjoyed the writing. I liked how it's mixed media in terms of Michael is also a poet, and we have bits in here that are his poems that are kind of like pasted into the narrative. I also really enjoyed the illustrations in here. It's not like overly illustrated, but there are just like little bits on the page that kind of go along with the text. As this is a young adult contemporary, I'm not really sure what else I can say about it. I enjoyed the characters. I really like the writing. I also listened to the audiobook along with reading this, which is narrated by Dean Atter, and that was definitely an enjoyable experience. It's how I prefer to read books that are told in verse, because you get a feel for the flow and things like that if you listen along to an audiobook at the same time. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the topics that were explored in here. There are a few bits that I did identify with certain characters saying certain things, and I definitely appreciated that. And if you're looking for a young adult queer contemporary to pick up, then I would recommend that you give this one a try. So that is it. Those are reviews of all the books that I read in the second half of October. It was a pretty good reading month. I'm sad that I have not yet finished My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. I'm 100 pages into this and I am enjoying this so far. I have a hefty November TBR, so I would have liked to have finished this by the end of the month. Alas, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen, but it's okay. I've pretty much made peace with the fact that I can't read everything, and I especially probably won't get to everything on my November TBR. But yeah, let me know how your guys' October went. What was your favorite book that you read in October? Have you read any of the books that I read in October, and what were your thoughts on them? But aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you will find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're a go and nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.